Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today is the first in a series of videos where we're going to give you some of the history of World War II, particularly events that relate to the Battleship New Jersey. In this video, we're going to cover the lead up to World War II. Believe it or not all historians agree on what date World War II began. Many of you are going to say that World War II began on December 7th, 1941. And that's sort of true for the United States, at least. Europe had already been at war since 1939. However, some historians set the date even further back in time. Some would argue that World War II began on the day the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of 1919. This put such restrictive effects on Germany and set up the post-World War. This put such restrictive effects on Germany and set up the post-war world in such a way that they believe World War II was inevitable at that point. It was just a matter of time. Different conflicts started as early as 1931. On September 18th of that year, Japan invaded Manchuria. The Manchurian invasion is especially where some Chinese historians place the beginning of World War II. So that, to them, begins the Second Sino-Japanese War, which doesn't end until Japan surrenders in 1945. Another war leading up to World War II was the Italian invasion of Abyssinia on October 3rd, 1935. Italy at this point was already a fascist regime, and their expansion into a previously uncolonized country marked the beginning of fascist expansions. The fact that the democratic nations that would become the Allied powers didn't do anything to stop them, and that the League of Nations, which was set up in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, proved that these fascist nations could continue to push. And some people say that because there was no pushback at this time, well then, war is inevitable from this point forward. Eventually, the free people would be pushed to the point where they would have to fight at some point. As you can see, there's still a couple of years before we get to that point. Germany began pushing on March 7th, 1936, when they remilitarized the Rhineland, in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. On July 17th, 1936, the Spanish Civil War began. This war was between the nationalist side of the government and a more fascist regime. It proved to be a training ground for many of the European countries that would fight in World War II. Many sent troops, ships, aircraft to either support one side or another, or train them, or on neutrality patrols around there, or whatnot. So many of the same units that we will see later on get their start here. The many bombers are tested for the first time. Oftentimes they're being flown by pilots from their design country, not Spanish pilots. So we're really starting to fight at this point. On April 1st, 1937, since Japan and Italy had refused to sign the Second London Naval Treaty, the escalator clause goes into effect, which means that the United States, Great Britain, and France, which had signed the treaties, can begin building larger warships than the treaties would allow. Now, this signifies two things. One, that the Axis powers had already begun designing larger warships because they refused to sign the treaty. And Two, it gives the Allied powers the ability to build like that, and these were the restrictions to which Battleship New Jersey herself were built. While the Second London Naval Treaty limited battleships to 14-inch guns and 35,000 ton standard displacement, the escalator clause, when not all the signatories signed it, allowed for that to go up to a 16-inch main gun battery and a 45,000 ton standard displacement. On July 7th of 1937, Japan invaded China proper, and this is where many historians say that the Second Sino-Japanese War began. Remember earlier, some historians say it began back in 1931 in Manchuria, but those who don't say it began here. So this is really the beginning of the war in Asia. At this point, still a fairly limited war between Japan and China, but eventually, as you'll see, many other nations are dragged in. On March 12, 1938, Germany annexed Austria. In September of that year, they annexed the Sudetenland. In August of 1939, having received no pushback up until this point, Germany signs the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement with Russia. And this peace agreement said that neither country would fight the other one, giving Germany a free hand to continue to invade other countries. What they did not realize was that France and Great Britain had gotten together before this, after having appeased and appeased and appeased Germany up to this point, and decided that they were finally drawing the line in the sand. Austria and Czechoslovakia both disappearing. Whatever the next country Germany invaded, they would get involved. Alright, so at this point, we're into September of 1939. Germany invades Poland, which causes a chain reaction. France and Great Britain say that they will get into the war in support of Poland, although they cannot directly support Poland. Germany and their new ally, the Soviet Union, invade Poland from different directions and annex that country. At that point, neither side is invading anyone for a while, and you get what's called the phony war. And then Germany begins to invade the Western European countries, some in Scandinavia, and then, of course, through Belgium and France. Around the same time, Russia goes to war with Finland, and then eventually it's just Great Britain left in the west and Russia in the east. Germany attacks Great Britain in the Battle of Britain from the air, cannot defeat the Royal Air Force, and so turns their attentions to the east and invades the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in America, as early as September 4th, 1939, President Roosevelt orders the U.S. military to begin neutrality patrols in the Western Atlantic to protect neutral shipping within 200 nautical miles of North America. By April 9th, when Germany invades Denmark and Norway, the United States has already started to shift members of the Pacific Fleet to the Atlantic, believing that the war will start there. However, in May of 1940, the battle force of the U.S. Navy, the fleet of battleships, is moved from their home port of San Diego to Pearl Harbor. The belief was that this would put them in a better position to defend the ring of island colonies that the United States held as a barrier against Japan. And by demonstrating the show of force about 1,500 miles closer to Japan, it would prevent them from further offensive action. So at this time, let's take a break and see what the U.S. Navy is doing with the battleship New Jersey. She and her sister ship Iowa were ordered in July of 1939 before most scholars would say that World War II had even started. By September of 1940, a year into what most scholars say World War II was, the battleship was laid down at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, showing that the United States was preparing for war before we actually entered it in December of 1941. Not only were we building new ships like New Jersey and the other vessels of the Two-Ocean Navy Act, existing ships were hurriedly getting modifications, and as early as 1939, 1940, and especially by 1941, they were starting to get additional anti-aircraft guns added, additional crew members added to their rosters, and they were starting to shed their peacetime paint in favor of wartime camouflage. On June 22nd of 1940, France surrendered to Germany. This gave the German Navy all of France's Atlantic seaboard to begin operating their merchant raiding fleet, primarily U-boats, but some surface ships out of. And these U-boats would be the first units to bring the war to the United States. On September 4th of 1940, the US and Great Britain signed the Destroyer for Bases Agreement, in which the United States gave Great Britain 50 old World War I four-stack destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on a number of British possessions so that the United States had forward bases to operate out of. December 26th of 1940, the King Board reports that US ships do not have adequate anti-aircraft protection on board. This will be a relevant report a year later. In 1941, on February 1st, the US Navy splits into an Atlantic and a Pacific fleet. Up until this time, it had been divided into a battle force, a scouting force, auxiliary forces, etc. Now, in preparation for a two-ocean war, they were dividing the fleet to fight on two fronts. Around this same time period, the US Navy switches from its color-coded war plans, which were designed to face a single threat, into the so-called rainbow war plans, designed to combine multiple color-coded enemies. In this case, orange Japan, black Germany, and green Italy. These rainbow war plans would have the United States fighting Germany, believed to be the more dangerous enemy, first, and then transferring to the Pacific to finish off Japan. This transfer from Atlantic to Pacific required that US ships during this time period be designed narrower than the 110-foot locks of the Panama Canal. Battleship New Jersey is designed to be 108 foot 3 inches wide, so she can barely fit through the locks. Many European battleships were designed wider than this, as were the Japanese Yamato-class battleships. And this made them more stable gun platforms. However, they could not rapidly transfer from one combat zone to another like the United States battleships. Heck, Italian battleships weren't even designed to leave the Mediterranean Sea. While they could technically fit, they didn't have the range to operate in the open Atlantic. So the United States designed ships with longer range and the ability to fit through the Panama Canal, and this would come in handy during World War II. Most of the major American ships were built in the Atlantic. However, the vast majority were needed in the Pacific, as Japan's surface navy was considerably greater than any of the other Axis powers. Even so, many ships saw service in both theaters and rotated back and forth at will, thanks to the Panama Canal and these design considerations. On March 30th, 1941, President Roosevelt ordered that all Axis ships in the United States be occupied and taken over by the U.S. On April 10th, the destroyer USS Nibluck detected a U-boat while rescuing survivors from a torpedoed Dutch tanker. She attacked the U-boat and this was the first offensive action of the war by the United States. As early as July 25th, 1941, different Coast Guard units, including the 327 class cutters, were transferred from the Coast Guard to Navy control, and they started operating primarily with convoy escorts. By the end of 1941, the entire Coast Guard will have been transferred. On August 9th, the U.S. Navy began guarding Allied convoys in the Western Atlantic. By covering convoys halfway across the Atlantic, it saved British destroyer escorts from having to make the whole journey. Destroyers don't have particularly long range, particularly when they have to zigzag to avoid U-boats. So by the United States covering half of the convoy, one, we're doubling the number of destroyers in the war because the US is joining Great Britain. Two, it's making the destroyers' trips more efficient. This also puts US destroyers in harm's way. On September 4th, USS Greer is fired on by the U-boat U-652. This is the first time a US warship came under fire during World War II. The German U-boat may not have even known that Greer was an American ship. It was a destroyer escorting a convoy, so they took the shot. However, President Roosevelt didn't fail to take advantage of the situation. And a week later, on September 11th, 1941, in one of his famous fireside chats, Roosevelt gives U.S. ships permission to attack any Axis forces operating in the U.S. neutrality zone. This will allow them to fire first without having to wait to be fired upon by the enemy, as had been the previous rule. On September 27th, the Liberty ship SS Patrick Henry is launched. She's she's the first of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be launched. As you can see, the United States had geared up for World War II before they were even in the war. They knew that they were going to take merchant ship losses, so they began replacing merchant ships even before they entered the war. On October 17th, 1941, a squadron of U.S. destroyers responded to a call for help from a British convoy under attack by a U-boat wolf pack, a group of German submarines operating together. During this action, the destroyer USS Kearney was hit and damaged by a German torpedo. The casualties on Kearney were the first American casualties of World War II. They take place 2 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. On October 30th, the USS Salamis, which was an American Navy oil tanker, was damaged by the U-boat U-106. The U-boat surfaced and began firing on the American oil tanker before the American oil tanker's guns were able to drive the U-boat away. The next day, on October 31st, the destroyer USS Reuben James became the first American ship sunk during World War II. A German U-boat torpedo sunk the World War I destroyer. Two months later, Japan would attack Pearl Harbor, and a couple days after that, Germany would declare war on the United States. This was the only time Germany declared war prior to invading. Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, leave a comment down below. Also comment with any questions or other stuff you have. If you guys like this, we'll continue to make more videos in a similar style. Remember to tune back in frequently to see more content from us. We are posting just about every day on various social media networks. And remember to like, share, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notifications whenever we post. Be sure to check the link down below in the description for ways you can support the museum, including a donate button.